Hey guys, so for my second build, I decided to do something niche as per usual for me. Niche and kind of meme. I wanted to try reflect or at least attempt to do reflect, but later I switched more to the counter attack build. It's sort of like a trigger attack when I get hit, when I get blocked, when I use our skill. And this video may not be very useful to most, but if you're searching some information about reflects or counter skills or echoes from the Void Knight and how it interacts with some other trigger, then this video may be for you. So I'm just gonna provide some information rather than a build guide, because the build that I was doing, I kind of refined it into sort of like a slam build, like one big hit build. Okay, so first of all, reflect damage is actually very weird in this game, and it's actually not very viable, sadly. A true reflect. There are two kind of reflects. There is percentage reflect damage, and then there is flat damage reflected to attackers. Reflect damage doesn't even count as damage, it seems. It cannot be scaled. There's only like one exception. It cannot be scaled normally because it's not even a damage. It doesn't even show up damage number. The enemies just straight up lose life when they take reflect. I believe it's not even a hit. So enemies don't even show damage numbers, they just lose life. So it's very hard to tell how much damage you're doing with your reflects. And like I said, it's pretty much impossible to scale it, because if you are gonna be trying to scale percentage reflect damage, like think about it. Some enemies, some bosses have like million HP, let's say. And let's say you get hit for 1000 damage and you reflect 2000 damage. Like that's nothing. That's literally nothing. For that reason, for bossing, it's gonna be terrible. Some bosses just hit very rarely and also like hit really hard, or with the mechanics that you're not supposed to get hit with. So reflect is not really gonna be able to do bosses. Now, like I said, the only exception for scaling reflect damage is this shield, Torrent Shell, unless maybe there's something new later on in the future. It rolls up to 90 flat damage reflected to attackers, and then you can scale that flat damage. I believe that's not just from the shield. There are like two other sources where you can get flat damage reflected to attackers. So that could scale with attunement. So let's say 9% increase flat damage reflected to attackers per attunement. So let's say at 100 attunement you could in theory get 900% increase of that flat damage. So I'm gonna show you the sources of flat damage. It can only roll on body armor and shield, but you're gonna be using that unique shield. So you pretty much can only get flat damage reflected to attackers on body armor. So let's say you get 130 flat damage. Combine it with this, which rolls up to 90, so 230 flat damage. And let's say you scale, like if you get a perfect shield, and then you get like 100 attunement, so you get 900% increase. So 230% plus 900% increase, you end up with like 2.3 thousand reflect damage to attackers. Attackers just lose that much life. But the problem is they're gonna have a lot more HP, like more than 10 times of this HP. For clearing, this is gonna work fine, but any tougher target's just not really gonna take much damage. And the percentage reflect damage you can get on a couple things. Again, on body armor, you can get, I'm just gonna ignore tier 7 because it's difficult to get. Tier 6, let's say if that is 6%, but you can also get on idols. On idols you can get like 35% for yourself, and you can stack a couple of these idols. So you could get 35 times 4, 140%, but I believe there was a unique body armor or something that gave like 100%. Actually, I probably should check it. Like 100% reflect. There is another unique body armor that gives flat reflect damage to attackers. Torn Shield, I believe, is from Spriggan, so that's from Druid, I believe, or from Shaman. There is a unique belt that gives flat reflect damage. Actually, maybe it could be scaled into endgame, but I can't really imagine being able to do enough damage against bosses. Like if bosses have, let's say, 1,000,000 HP, how many times would you need to get hit? Oh, another big problem for reflect, percentage reflect, is that it is after mitigation. So it's at a damage that you take, from the damage that you take, not from the damage that you would have taken before mitigation. So you cannot really be tanky, because if you're tanky, then you're gonna take less damage and you're gonna reflect less damage with the percentage reflect. And if you want to be tanky, then you kind of have to ignore percentage reflect and just stack flat reflect. And also I believe reflect, because it's not a true damage, it's not a true hit, you cannot apply ailments. So you cannot really poison with the reflected damage, just like in Path of Exile, I guess. So reflect damage is very limiting, and it's very hard to scale because you pretty much have to stack attunement, use the unique shield, and then maybe a couple other uniques that have flat damage that normally doesn't have on normal modifiers. So you're gonna have to supplement reflect with something else anyway. Now another thing that I was scaling, since I couldn't get reflect damage early on, percentage or flat reflect early on, I was playing with the Sentinel with the sort of like counter attack build. There are multiple things that can trigger when you get hit. From the Sentinel, from this one, Retribution. I believe this rolls up to, yes, a 30% chance when you get hit to counter attack enemies with Retribution. And Retribution scales, as you can see, with strength, and it only has 100% damage effectiveness. So it's not really gonna be very big. However, by allocating these passive points, you can guarantee 100% base crit chance. This is not increased crit chance, this is just base crit chance. So with a Retribution, you can pretty much always crit. And Retribution damage is actually pretty okay. You can stack like flat damage, increase melee damage. It is a melee damage. However, you kind of have to be able to reach enemies with a melee attack. So your weapon range will also matter. In game it doesn't show weapon range, but weapons do have range. So against distant enemies, this is gonna be useless. Pretty much everything against distant enemies except flat reflect and percentage reflect are gonna be useless. But counterattack and banish works pretty well, I would say, and it can proc like 5 times per second. So when clearing, this works really well, I would say. You can also have this thing, but if you're gonna be scaling melee, this is not really gonna synergize very well. Whenever you hit an enemy, you have a chance to throw an axe. So whenever enemies hit you, you can have a chance to proc a Retribution, which then will hit enemies, and that will have a chance to proc an axe. So you can add that on top, but again, the axe damage, like compare the damage numbers 272 versus Retribution, which is 1.2 thousand. So the axe doesn't really have much damage because it's a projectile. Next, I went with the Void Knight because I was thinking like the Void Knight passive bonus has 10% chance to repeat your attacks and spells half a second later, and you can actually get more chance by getting this one, and this one I believe is actually different because this one repeats after 1 second rather than after half a second. So this plus this is 20, and then this one is like 30% chance and another 5% chance to repeat after 1 second. So you could stack chances to repeat. However, from my testing, it seems that you cannot echo a triggered attack. You can only echo an attack that you perform animation with your character. If it trigger a Retribution from this, it will never be echoed by Void Knight, which is the saddest part, because if it worked, you could stack chance to echo and you could actually get pretty decent like counter attacks, because there are so many things that you can trigger with this. I'm gonna show you in a moment, but yeah. The echoes don't really work with anything that is triggered. So next, how we can add more stuff to trigger. Skills, Vengeance. The Vengeance is not like in Path of Exile. This Vengeance, you actually have to use that Vengeance, like perform an attack. And then after you perform an attack, you will kind of prepare a riposte incoming hit. So once you attack with Vengeance, you can riposte an enemy attack. And you can add like additional riposte, so you can, after one attack, you can riposte twice, and riposte scales pretty well, I would say. Like look at this 2.4 thousand damage, and remember Retribution had 1.2 thousand. So riposte could actually have pretty decent damage, and it felt really good while clearing, but against bosses it just felt bad. Like nothing's gonna help against bosses with counters. So here's another thing. So you can, after using Vengeance, prepare a riposte. And then you can also add Iron Blades, which actually have pretty bad scaling. The Iron Blade is 1.6k damage, but well, it does have a chance to deal double damage, but it didn't feel like it was doing much damage. So the Iron Blade is just kind of a flying blade towards through the enemies, piercing all the enemies, it seems. And it is melee, it's not a projectile even, it's still a melee hit, it seems. So it scales with melee, the Iron Blade, and not projectiles. You can actually see the attacks, physical and melee. Here's the thing, there is a chance to proc Iron Blade when you use Vengeance, when you use Riposte, when the Riposte hits, and the Vengeance kills, and then when the Riposte kills. So there are 5 things that can proc Iron Blade. And this thing I mean, it's not a true counterattack because you still have to use Vengeance, but you can, like I said, proc Iron Blade on Vengeance and on Vengeance skill to spam it faster. But it doesn't really scale very well. Like I said, it has only 100 damage effectiveness, so it just doesn't scale that well. Although you can get 45% chance to deal double damage for it. You can also like make it clear better with ricochets, like it splits instead of piercing. So Vengeance is kind of a main thing that adds lots of counter-like attacks and triggers. Now another thing is multi-strike, sort of. Multi-strike is on block. This one. You have a chance to retaliate with multi-strike swords on block. This is a bit, I guess, confusing because you have a chance to proc not multi-strike skill itself but multi-strike's sword. So when you strike with multi-strike, you just kind of smash enemy with downward attack, and then additional enemies nearby can get hit by additional like swords that appear, which can be replaced by axes that hit twice or spears. But for this you need to have high chance to block, and it is still percentage to block and then percentage on block to trigger it. But it has a 3-second cooldown, so it's not that great. However, you can turn this sword into a smite, but smite is a spell based, not an attack. But you can also turn it into a smite, which can be void damage as well, which may scale better with the Void Knight. However, if you pick up this one to hit twice with the axe, then and pick up this one, it will only proc smite once. And remember, smite is a spell, so it's not really good. Also, as I understand, like this one is initial strike for multi-strike, but you're not hitting with multi-strike itself, you're hitting with multi-strike swords, if you're talking about this one. So I think this initial strike damage will not work, and base critical strike chance probably would work because it's not an initial hit, but it's still part of the multi-strike. So it should still work. Also, you're not getting armament stacks. We can verify by using observing if you get armor and block effectiveness when it triggers from this one. Whenever you use multi-strike normally, you would get armament stacks. But when it triggers, it doesn't get armament stacks. So that's another confirmation that it doesn't trigger multi-strike itself, but it triggers multi-strike swords. So this one is kind of weaker trigger, and like I said, you need a high chance to block. Another like thing that could synergize with counterattacks is Rebuke, because while channeling Rebuke you take 80% less damage, and you can increase the duration to like 4 seconds, something like that. Like you cannot move, but you are very tanky while channeling Rebuke, so that way you can kind of channel it and wait for enemies to hit you and reflect them damage to you, but not with the percentage reflect, because you're gonna be tankier and you're gonna be taking less damage and you're gonna be reflecting less damage. But if you use flat reflect, Rebuke would work pretty well. You also do not want to stun enemies, because stun enemies won't hit you and you won't be able to reflect and counter. I looked into our like Forge Guard and Paladin what we have, and we don't really have anything good for reflects. It seems like Void Knight, Void Knight also doesn't really have anything good, but it does have a lot of flat damage which can work for all the counter attacks. But otherwise, if you want to be focused on purely like true reflect, you probably would want to go with Paladin to be able to regen faster. Paladin has a lot more regen and it's more like a support class, semi-support class. Another thing, the item wise, I was using this one for Vengeance, but essentially it just gives more levels to Vengeance, so you can get all the Iron Blade procs. Like a true reflect build, you would want something better. And as for the shield, I was using this shield because I am Void Knight, so I was getting quite a lot of void damage and just flat damage. Obviously for reflect damage you would want to use this one and then stack attunement. This one also has increased melee physical damage implicit, and Paladin does have more support for physical. Void Knight is just mostly pure void damage. You can get more attunement as Paladin. So if you want to go flat reflect damage, you probably would want to go with Paladin. So yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to say about the counters and reflects. If someone knows some other methods to do, like I know that there's like lighting torrents or something like that for mage. During it you get up to 100% reflected damage, but again, reflect damage is not really very good because you need to get hit really hard to reflect more damage, so it's not really viable, I would say, unless maybe with like Mega Ward. Now another thing, actually that's not all. Another thing I can mention, this one, every 3 seconds your next melee attack deals increased damage. This does get consumed. You can actually see this buff, this icon disappears whenever I trigger something. Like for example, I just stand still and wait, and it triggers retribution, and it does consume that stack. Or maybe it did trigger the multi-strike. Actually, I'm not sure because I had all the things. Maybe it was triggering multi-strike's sword. But either way, it was consuming this one. However, this one does not get consumed by a movement ability. So even like Void Cleave does not consume this. Like this one is not really a good synergy if you're gonna be countering with many things, but it could add like a sudden burst of damage. Now there is another thing that I kind of wanted to test, but I have not tested because I need level 75. This one, your melee skills consume up to, this is actually pretty good roll, up to 2000 ward, gaining 1 melee damage per 10 ward consumed. This technically could give you 200 flat damage, flat melee damage, which I assume is physical, to any attack, but I have not tested to see if the counter attacks would consume your ward. Either way, you would need a lot of ward sustain and to build up ward to trigger this, because each time you trigger it, you would consume like, let's say 2000 ward, or in this case 1794 ward, and before the next trigger you have to recover that to get full damage. But don't forget that you're also getting hit by enemies and you're losing ward. So I'm curious if this would actually work with the counter attacks and triggered attacks, or would it only work with the attacks that you perform as a character with the animation. But either way, this probably could be another way of scaling your counter attacks, but not Reflect. I think Reflect just has very limited scalability. Although I'm pretty sure someone in the chat is gonna say that, oh, Flat Reflect is actually really good and it can clear corrupted monoliths no problem. Maybe. I find it hard to believe that it would work really well. Besides, you wouldn't see damage numbers, so it's not fun. Seeing big damage is more fun. So that's actually what I am reworking my build into. This is gonna be focused on Erasing Strike and Void Cleave, and it's kind of like a slam skill in Path of Exile. You kind of buff yourself, debuff enemies, and then slam once and do big damage. So this one, I'm currently level 71. The highest damage I saw was, I believe, 80,000 with a critical, which I can guarantee. But I'm still working on this and still tweaking, and this is like I said, 71. The defenses of this build are kind of questionable for now. I'll try to figure out how to survive later and how to get more damage, and maybe I'll make an updated video for the, what do I call it, big bonk build. So for now, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.